Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Laura Cohen, and I'm the Executive Director of the Harriet and Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College at the City University of New York in Bayside, Queens. Our mission is to use the lessons of the Holocaust to educate current and future generations about the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. We want to extend a warm welcome to everyone joining us today as we commemorate Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. This commemoration is a powerful reminder that both the catastrophe of and lessons from the Holocaust continue to reverberate both here and abroad. 6 million Jewish people vanquished from the planet. And today we remember those who perished, those who survived, and those who now carry these memories deep within us. We're living once again in increasingly fraught times, where the scourge of anti-Semitism and xenophobia continue to spread further across the world, fueling white nationalism, neo-fascism, hate speech, and Holocaust distortion. And as we watch with horror the widespread suffering, mass atrocities, and sexual violence being committed right now during Russia's war with Ukraine, it's hard to not be reminded also of the wanton suffering, destruction, and genocide, the Shoah, committed on that same soil against Ukraine's Jewish population during World War II. Yet traces of that world remain in our hearts, in our collective memory, and in the earth, which brings us to the theme of this evening's event, what they left behind. Preservation of Holocaust memory today. We're excited to welcome our two special guests, Jane Wells, who directed the new short documentary film we'll be screening tonight entitled Preserving the Holocaust, and Hannah Wilson, a doctoral researcher in Holocaust studies, who will discuss the excavation work being done at the Sobibor extermination camp. Our event is underwritten by the HaShoah and Edna Eisenberg Memorial Fund and is co-sponsored by the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center at Manhattan College, the Ray Walpole Institute at Western Washington University, and the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights at Rutgers University. Rabbi Eisenberg was the longtime scholar in residence here at the KHC, who wrote as well as curated many of our center's most powerful exhibitions. But Rabbi Eisenberg's memory is not strictly confined to the past. He's also very much present as the memorial fund established in his name provides support to the KHC's student curatorial interns. The only way we can keep the memory of the Holocaust alive is by making it relevant to young people who know little to nothing about it. Because let's be very clear, never again is now. Before we begin, please be sure to submit any of your questions that you have via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Now, we're going to switch gears and we're going to now watch the film together, Preserving the Holocaust. It's about 10 minutes long, and it follows a group of young Polish conservators who are preserving artifacts from the Auschwitz-Birkenau extermination and concentration camp.
This is one of our laboratories as well, conservation rooms. Here you can see my colleagues carry on conservation of suitcases and prostheses. It's actually something interesting because you can see now the layer she's removing. This is what she's removing, and this is the effect of the removal. This was the protective coating for metal. So whoever did try to protect the metal also. And our job is to remove the one which are harmful and put the one which will help the objects in the first place, and then will be easy in the future for the future generations.
I'm removing a conservation lacquer which has been used to protect the object in the 1980s, in the end of the 80s. And now I'm removing it because it's getting yellowish, for example, and also does not fulfill any purposes of or in the conservation field anymore. Because you see there's paper here, we have wooden material, we have metal here on the side. The metal parts we have to protect again with a conservation lacquer, but for the paper it's not necessary. The aim, the challenge of my work, I have to make sure that the material as the support of the historical information will survive for the future. It depends on the condition of the object, so if it's quite in good condition, so I think I spent around 2 weeks, but it can last up to 4 weeks, for example, the whole conservation process. And let's say whole, so I try to, as I said, to cut myself off from the emotional feelings to concentrate on the work I have to do.
I have here leg prothesis. What you can see here, this artificial limb is not really complete, so the part here is lost, and also the cover with leather. And during conservation treatments, as my colleague Margaret said before, for example on leather, kind of wax, and wax is not good, but in the past therefore it might be a good conservation treatment, conservation method. And the colleagues in the past doesn't put it just also on the leather, also as well also on metal elements, and I try to reduce this kind of wax and also kind of anti-corrosion varnish which we added in the past, because this upper part is almost clean, and this part is before reducing this old varnish with solvents.
So this was given to us by the archaeological team, and it was literally excavated last week. And first we received such a piles. They were found near crematorium number 5 in Birkenau. They brought these things to us to try to, well, clean it, and they said that those are parts of the book. And they found it in different places, so probably it's not the same book. Besides the suitcases, we also take care of paper objects, which we receive from Archive, not the collection department. And here you have an example of Auschwitz maps. Okay, so now she's sort of straightening a bit the folds before the scanning, because then all the maps and letters, they are scanned.
gradual conservation of all the brick barracks as the first aim of Master Plan of Preservation in Birkenau. The problem here was that they were built by the Germans, and the working people here were also the Soviet prisoners. So the materials weren't great. It was done in autumn and winter, which is not a good time for building anything. Our main aim is to protect the original substance and the original walls. So that's why we decided to straighten the walls instead of something that is usual in building and renovation, let's say. I think that could take 25 up to 30 years. Of course, there are also other objects like crematoria. There are also some works being done, and wooden barracks. But in general, all those works could last about that time. I like the feeling of peace here, of this very static inside of the barrack. It's another layer of what we are doing here, because the first aim of every conservator is to keep the historical substance and the building, but the real reason is to keep the remains of the people who were here. You remember that for many people those interiors were the last they stayed in. Some of them died building them. Many of them suffered here. So it's very the influence of the object is very big for us, yes. And it's again, it's a closing, it's a summary for our work, because it's the main reason we work here, for that remembrance, yes.
So now we'd like to invite and introduce Jane Wells, who's a documentary filmmaker and activist whose films focus on global human rights and social justice issues. She's produced over 40 films, short films, including the award-winning shorts, I'm Not a Victim, Not a Criminal, Lost Hope and Native Silence. She's also the producer of the feature documentary films, The Devil Came on Horseback, Tricked, A Different American Dream, and Lost in Lebanon. In 2005, Wells became involved with The Devil Came on Horseback, which is a feature-length documentary about the genocide in Darfur. She ultimately became a producer of the film, traveling to the country with her son to bear witness to the state of affairs. In 2007, she founded Three Generations, a nonprofit organization that uses films to document stories of witness to crimes against humanity through documentary film, oral history, witness testimony, and creative writing. Her articles in genocide and human rights have appeared in British Vogue, Diversion, and Weston, and she's a regular guest blogger on the Huffington Post and The Hub. Jane, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here on this very important day. I'm grateful to everybody who's joined in. I hope that everybody got an idea about that film. And I did want to speak a little bit about how we came to make that, because we went to film at Auschwitz-Birkenau, and I was speaking to some of the people there setting the filming up. And I said, what could we possibly film that not everyone films or that hasn't been filmed before? And the people there said, oh, you must come and see what we're doing behind the scenes, because that's something that hasn't been filmed. And so we were given the opportunity to spend half a day, a morning, with the conservators behind the scenes at the museum. And I had absolutely no idea what we were going to find or film, or whether anyone spoke English or not. And it was just, for me, a completely unexpected and deeply moving experience to meet these young, very young Polish conservators who are so dedicated to the work of preserving the objects that are seen in the museum that maybe some of you have seen, but also doing the archaeological work. And every day it seems that they are finding new objects and memorializing them, cleaning them up, and preserving the ones that had been here before. And I was just incredibly moved by how these dedicated young people had done postgraduate study in that level of conservation. And I was thinking back to when I was a student in university and thinking about what to do, and there was only one possibility of sort of doing conservation in art history. And yet here were people who have specialized in paper conservation, metal conservation, leather conservation, and all these different subspecialists. And they have spent years learning to the expertise that they showed there. And I just found it unexpectedly and deeply moving. And there was a little bit you see there with a woman called Margaret, who works with the suitcases. And I asked her, how long do you spend with each one? And she spends 2 to 4 weeks with a suitcase, and just trying to understand what her emotional connection with that object is, and how she deals with the emotion of something where somebody has put all their possessions into that suitcase, and that may be all that we know or have remaining of them, was very moving then. And when I see refugees leaving Ukraine today with their bags and young children with their backpacks, it becomes even more haunting and more powerful for me to think that there are these conservators working to preserve these things and the evidence of what happened. So that's really the story of this film. And it was very gratifying to be able to go. I was working on a bigger film, a feature film, but to make a short film out of this. And we've shown it at a number of film festivals, and it has actually won a couple of awards along the way. But it seemed great and important that it could be part of this lecture, thinking about what they left behind. And I was thinking about that with regard to the work I do at 3 Generations today, because most of the work we do, or a lot of the work we do, and I have done, has been based on the foundational story of the organization, which was the film that my father made in 1945 about the liberation of the concentration camps, called German Concentration Factual Survey. And in a way, this was a film that was never shown complete and shown in my father's lifetime, but has been shown since. And it was, for me personally, what he left behind in terms of the legacy of the work I do. And so it has a very fitting meaning for me to be part of this lecture today. I am not a lecturer, I'm not an academic, so I think that is probably enough from me for right now. And I hand it back to Dr. Cohen.
Thank you so much, Jane. I had the opportunity to visit those facilities at Auschwitz-Birkenau, and we'll definitely get into that in the conversation. But just for perspective, Auschwitz-Birkenau has a team And Hannah, our next speaker is going to get into the conversation about what's going on at Sobibor. But just to put in perspective for everyone here, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum has a series of 5 encyclopedias that document 44,000 different concentration camp sites and ghettos. So when we think about what it means to preserve the legacy of the Holocaust and the material artifacts, we have to think about the scale and what's actually possible. So now I would like to introduce Hannah Wilson. She's a doctoral researcher in the Department of History at Nottingham Trent University, where she was awarded full funding from the Arts and Humanities Research Council. Previously, she studied fine art at the University of Leeds and undertook a master's degree in Holocaust studies from the University of Haifa in Israel, where she was awarded the prize for original research by Yad Vashem. From 2014 to the present, she has participated as a research student at the archaeological excavations at Sobibor and Treblinka. She was also part of the team that created the new Holocaust exhibition at the Imperial War Museum in London. She's a volunteer writer with the Wiener Library in London, as well as the British Association for Holocaust Studies, and received a fellowship from the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure to work at the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. Hannah, the floor is yours.
So first of all, I'd like to say a huge thank you to the organisers of this very meaningful event, and to Jane for her crucial work into the role of conservators. I think we'll all agree that was a very moving film. So I first arrived at the site of the former death camp Sobibor in eastern Poland in 2014 to join the archaeological excavations taking place that summer. Guided by the archaeologist, I stepped off the public path into the surrounding woodland and was disturbed to find gnarled, rusting barbed wire crudely wrapped around thick tree trunks. Back by the circular memorial mound, I kneeled closer to the sandy grass, only to discover fragments of ash and cremated bone. The following day, I joined the team to dig and sift in the earth in the area by the remains of the gas chambers. There, on the makeshift metal sieve, gleamed a pearl and silver earring standing against the rock and debris. And some 70 years later, on that day, I held in my hand tangible evidence of a murdered human being, a sign of personal expression, identity, and womanhood. The owner of these beautiful earrings had chosen to wear this pair, perhaps her favorite, on the day she would be killed at Sobibor. The former site of Sobibor Death Camp seems a peaceful place, remote, quiet, and enclosed by nature. Yet the deceptive beauty of the surrounding woodland and few neighbouring residents, however, cannot conceal the terrible and violent history of this site. Sobibor is a place that has witnessed extreme violence, politicization, and even repoliticization as a result of the more recent archaeological, material, and museological developments. Through various stages of preservation and commemoration, the site has transformed from a space of non-memory into a place of remembrance and mourning. But only recently has the narrative of Sobibor Death Camp started to integrate into the narrative of Holocaust memory as we now know it, with a stronger focus on perpetration, memorialization, touristification, and excavation. For years, it's remained on the periphery. But it's exactly this absence of memory and materiality that stimulated the forensic and material turn at the site in the early 2000s. This has been embodied by a 10-year period of forensic research and archaeological excavations, as well as the decision of the Polish state in 2011 to build a new museum and memorial in coordination with an international steering committee under the umbrella of the Majdanek State Museum. So following the years of neglect and contested memorialization, archaeologists began to shed new light on public memory and the collective consciousness of Sobibor. Not only has this form of research revealed further physical evidence of topographical camp structures, but it's also helped to restore the memory of those victims who did not survive to tell their experiences through objects and fragmented material traces. While there's evidence of archaeological work taking place at the site of Auschwitz-Birkenau as early as 1962, excavations at Holocaust sites have evolved into their own forensic discipline from the 1980s onward. By utilizing traditional methods of historical and combat archaeology, the field of Holocaust archaeology approaches the memory, material culture, and preservations of sites from this specific conflict. Much like the revision and shift of commemorative narratives at former campsites in Poland, forensic work can also be understood within the broader context of changing transnational perspectives on Holocaust heritage. Concerning the Operation Reinhard camp specifically, so that's Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. Operation Reinhard was the code name given by the Germans for the plan to murder all of the Jews in the general government area in Poland. British archaeologist Caroline Sturdy-Coles has performed multiple excavations at the site of Treblinka, while Belget's camp was also investigated for a short period of time, but the vast memorial that was built there has prevented any further excavation being done on site. At Sobibor, the first excavations were led in 2000 to 2001 by Andrei Koller at the Nicholas Copernicus University in Turin, who used the particularly invasive and contested method of drilling. As Isaac Gilead notes, the Professor Koller was allowed to drill mass graves is considered by Orthodox Jews as a monumental failure. Through this method, his team found mass graves and the remains of 5 structures, as well as approximately 873 artifacts, which were then transferred for conservation at Majdanek State Museum, though not much of his work was published. Richard Fruand also conducted some small excavations at the site with a team from the University of Hartford in the US, using only geophysics. In this study, however, I'll focus on excavations that I've been involved with personally, the role of the archaeologists at Sobibor, and of the material culture unearthed there. Indeed, the wild-scale excavations at Sobibor have been the largest of any other former death camp, and most importantly, have created a substantial archive of objects from below ground. In 2007, on behalf of Ben-Gurion University, Yad Vashem, and the Wadowa Museum in Poland, Polish archaeologist Wojciech Mazurek and Israeli archaeologist Yoram Haimi began working together to try and uncover as much physical information regarding the site as possible. Mazurek of Subterra Archaeological Research in Chelm had already completed some non-invasive geophysics at Sobibor in 2004. Yoram Haimi of the Israel Antiquities Authority had personally lost family members there, including 2 cousins from his mother's side who'd been born in Morocco. This was the main motivation for his involvement. Archaeological research at the site of the Sobibor extermination camp allows us to physically touch the Holocaust beyond the limited evidence provided by historical documents. The excavation enabled us to reconstruct the camp accurately, and uncovering artifacts allows us to uncover more of its victims' story. Alongside a team of skilled local workers, including Mazurek's sons, the archaeologists referred to a wider variety of historical resources, such as maps, sketches, drawings, and aerial photographs, as well as the accounts of Sobibor witnesses as a basis for their research. Jaime was able to consult personally with Yehuda Lerner and Simcha Bialovich, who were living in Israel at the time and escaped Sobibor during the uprising in October 14th, 1943, while Simcha's brother Philip Bialovich was even able to see the excavations himself. Though many visitors came to the site during the excavations, including relatives of Sobibor victims, myself and American filmmaker Gary Hochman were permitted as unofficial members of the excavation team. As the project unfolded, a strong working relationship between Jaime and Mazurek, who were able to bring different historical backgrounds and investigative methods to the excavations. From my perspective, this also contributed to the strength of their investigation alongside the hard work of their team members. The high level of trust and support between the international actors involved, both Jewish and non-Jewish, allowed for deeper communication and understanding of what was being unearthed, and their findings might represent history for the memory of the site and ways to disseminate this into knowledge to the wider public. Initially, Jaime and Mazurek's goal had been to reconstruct the original plan of the former campsite, the former details of which had been insufficient and inaccurate, despite previous investigations and scientific research. The team have since excavated a huge amount of terrain at the site, and the excavations have successfully covered the remains and former locations of several important camp features, including the correct location of the Schlaug, or Road to Heaven, in 2011, so the road that the arrivals at Sobibor were marched down naked to their death at the gas chambers. They also discovered the female haircutting barracks, the original railway ramp constructed within the camp, the Sonder Commando barracks, a number of previously undetermined graves, and even traces of a failed escape tunnel. Excavations in Camp 1 and 2 revealed buildings and refuse pits full of wartime artifacts used by Travniki guards in the camp and the undressing area of the new arrivals. Further investigations of Camp 3 and the mass grave area uncovered newer pits of bone and ash fragments, possibly from the cremation of camp inmates who did not escape during the uprising. An area in which approximately 1,830 bullet casings were also revealed a shooting range, possibly for the prisoners who were unable to physically make it to the gas chambers. So indeed, the methodological digging and excavation squares conducted by Mazurek and Jaime's team provided the new forensic framework of research at the site and hope for future discoveries. While this process is time-consuming and requires extensive physical labor, it has also allowed for more intricate findings to be made and better trace soil inconsistencies below the ground. The archaeologists at Sobibor have faced the challenge of the natural landscape. Time is spent cutting down trees, removing roots, and burning foliage. They have also contended with man-made changes to the site, such as the impact of post-war looting and the establishment of large-scale memorials during the 1960s, which directly impacted the terrain. More primitive tools, such as shovels and sieves, are used, which require modification and repair, paid for by the archaeologists, to catch the smallest fragments of human remains and precious metals. The use of the sieve also requires direct tangibility in a process of selection, and the methods of excavation in the case of Sobibor has directly expanded the legacy and material memory of the camp, leading to new historical research and investigation beyond the limits of traditional research. Since beginning, the archaeologists also unearthed approximately 11,000 personal belongings. As Caroline Sturdy-Cole suggests, sites that are devoid of physical evidence and remote in location like Sobibor must find alternate ways in which to engage with the public. One such alternative way is through the mediation of artifacts. Those uncovered through the excavations at Sobibor, including eyeglasses, alcohol bottles, ladies' hair pins, wooden chess pieces, bottles, toiletries, tools, gold teeth, and wedding bands, as well as perpetrator items such as bullet casings, have had a substantial impact on public memory. Those items with an obvious link to Judaism or which bear a prominent Jewish symbol are not as common, but are obviously categorized by the archaeologists as special findings. Through these, the memory of Sobibor and its Jewish victims begin to be restored, as was diminished through the years of neglect and misplaced commemoration efforts. Most significant, however, are the small number of identifiable artifacts, 14 in total, some of which have enabled us to reconstruct victims' biographies and even track down living family relatives. This is the case of the name tag belonging to a 6-year-old Dutch girl named Leah Judith de la Penha, who was deported to Sobibor from Westerbork in the Netherlands, and a pendant belonging to Carolina Kohn, who had been deported to Sobibor from Frankfurt, then to Minsk. As Anna Frank was thought to have a similar pendant, its discovery gained coverage around the world, which you might have seen yourselves. This is the name tag up close. The uncovering of traces of Carolina Kohn's necklace pendant resulted in a Stoppelstein being placed for her name in Frankfurt. The case of personalized items being uncovered at Sobibor, it's not the case at Treblinka, for instance, has of course resulted in greater public awareness and interest in the camp's history. As with the excavations themselves, there are also underlying ethical and anthropological debates surrounding the discovery of these objects. The State Museum at Majdanek retains every object unearthed during the excavation period. They include items for which we've been able to track down relatives due to their biographical identifications. However, the families are not permitted to take these items since they are expected to remain in Poland as part of the new museum exhibition, which opened in 2021. Much to the upset of the descendants that I've spoken with, they're not even granted the privilege to touch them without wearing special gloves, whereas I have done so during the excavations. The most evocative instance of this tension is illustrated by the finding of a name tag uncovered during the archaeological phase of the area of Camp 3. The tag engraved with the name and address belonged to David Dedizak, a young Dutch Jewish boy who was born in Amsterdam on February 23, 1935, and murdered in Sobibor on June 11, 1943 at the age of 8. Following further research, archaeologists were able to reconstruct the fate of his family members, most of whom, including David's parents, were murdered in Sobibor. But his cousin, Lies Carranza, survived the war in hiding and still lives in Amsterdam today. Informed about the discovery, Carranza was invited to a memorial service held for David by the Majdanek State Museum at the site of Sobibor later that year. Accompanied by her son, she traveled to Poland for the memorial, fully expecting to return to the Netherlands with David's name tag in her possession. At the ceremony, however, Lies Carranza was presented with a framed replica of the tag. Only after she returned to Amsterdam did she realize how upset she felt. In our interview, she told me, "I am angry about their refusing to give me back the original. I am legally the owner of the name tag. It makes me angry because I cannot bear that something of my cousin stays in that terrible place where my family is murdered, only because of rules." So Lisa's since been outspoken about her situation, appearing on Dutch television to appeal for legal advice. Unfortunately, Polish law dictates that if something of value is found in the ground, it automatically becomes property of the state. When I asked her about what she would do with the name tag if she were able to retrieve it, she asserted that with the approval of her children, she would donate it to the Holocaust Museum in Amsterdam to ensure its preservation and potential for public engagement. She quite simply does not want the only belonging of her cousin to remain on the very site of his murder in a country in which she has no affiliation outside of the Holocaust. The personal debate surrounding the restitution of David Sack's name tag is multi-layered and deeply sensitive. However, the value of this tag in terms of the new museum's exhibition is high and contributes something of importance to their exhibition under development there. One can understand why they would not wish to part with it. However, while Lisa's still alive, David is part of her living memory. She lost so much of her family during the war that she was left with virtually nothing of her former childhood, and she now views David as her guardian angel and attributes him directly to her survival on a spiritual level. Certainly in the case of Sobibor, where families were quite literally obliterated, to find an identifiable object or belonging is quite extraordinary. In my research, then, I suggest that we can view these items as being extensions of the body, and perhaps that they should be treated in the same way as we would treat human remains. One can look into the ethical debates surrounding repatriation and the reburial of remains for other mass killings and genocides like Rwanda, for instance, as an example of how to approach this issue. In fact, Lise even donated her replica tag to the Holocaust Museum in Amsterdam, where it's currently on display as part of a children's exhibition. Alongside David's family history and the object itself is a video recording of Lise talking about her life and memory before she calls out the museum at Sobibor for their refusal to return the tag. In deciding to include this testimony in such a public space, which outrightly questions the decision of another institution, the museum in Amsterdam also assumes the role of social memory activist and no longer remains neutral in their position. Similarly, the location of the museum, housed in the former Jewish crest where David was held prior to his deportation, outlines the importance of home in Western burial traditions. If the name tag were to be returned to the Netherlands where David lived out his short years, it would provide Lise with the opportunity to grieve and confront her past trauma before she too passes. So certainly Lisa's response reminds us that there's no easy solution to the ongoing ethical and moral issues surrounding global Holocaust commemoration and memory preservation, and especially when it comes to Sobibor. As the site's development falls into the hands of both national and transnational political actors, it's my concern that the true value of the objects uncovered at Sobibor may become lost as the struggle for memory ownership continues. Though new research is still being conducted into some of our findings from 2017, including 5 nameplates which were uncovered close to the area where the new building stands, which you can see in the slide here. However, it remains the responsibility of the new Sobibor Memorial and Museum to ensure that these objects are utilised in a meaningful and accessible way, as their value and role becomes increasingly important in the post-survivor area. So due to time, I will stop there, and I think we're going to open for questions. So let me just stop sharing my screen there.
Anna, that was incredibly powerful. It was kicking up a lot of emotion. So before I start to talk, I wanted to invite into the conversation Marissa Hollywood, who's been with the KHC for a decade, and many of you know. She currently serves as Associate Director, developing public programs and leading educational initiatives. And previously, she was Executive Director of the Queens Historical Society. A cultural historian and museum professional, she's worked at history institutions throughout the New York City area and is the author of 2 books about local history. Marissa, I'm turning it over to you.
So for tonight's program, the goal was to honor memories of the Holocaust, while also recognizing the memory preservers. These unseen heroes in the shadows of the archive, conservation lab, or in the case of our presenters, the excavation site and the edit room. People who dedicate their time to immersing themselves in history. In the field of Holocaust and genocide studies, this is a weighty task. This is pain. This is death. This is reliving someone's journey through hell and many times discovering that they didn't make it. So why do we do this work? I've been a staff member at the Holocaust Center for almost 10 years now. And obvious reasons why this work needs to be done: to remember those that perished, to capture the stories from those who survived, and to quote from our organization's mission, to educate current and future generations about the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. But why do we personally do this work? A study published in the American Journal of Orthopsychiatry in 1995, I'm sure many of you will know this reference I'm about to make, showed documented proof that workers who were merely processing archival materials from the Holocaust were showing signs of post-traumatic stress disorder. The article was entitled, "Working with Traumatic Material Effects on Holocaust Memorial Museum Staff." And this was a study of United States Memorial Museum staff that was conducted prior to the museum officially opening. In regular professionally facilitated group meetings of staff, researchers found reports of sleep disturbances, personalization of trauma, anger and alienation, denial, and I'm going to specify here, not denial of the Holocaust, but rather like a disassociation, so denying that they were in distress from reviewing the materials, and a numbness. And all of this, I think, is perfectly understandable to the four of us and to anyone watching. And Jane, I'm sure that your team spent hours in the field getting footage and conducting interviews. And Hannah, as a doctoral student in this field, I can't even imagine how many hours you spent just reviewing horrific things. So could each of you speak about why you choose to do this work? Like, what does it mean to you personally? How do you get through the emotional toll? Maybe I'll invite Jane first and then Hannah.
I was hoping I would not be the first one, but I'm thinking I'm going to tell a slightly indiscreet story here, just to not to make light of this. But when I was with a team member and we left one of the concentration camps at the end of a really long and intense and grueling day, my co-worker, we got in the car and my co-worker said to me, "God, that was boring." And I went completely internally, I sort of went mental. And I had to take the nameless person to a nearby airport, and I could not drive there fast enough. I was so furious and couldn't even begin to think how I would ever speak to this person again. And then after we had parted and I thought about it, I realized that that was just a sort of self-defense mechanism, and I hadn't, and I kind of fell for it. But I think that's an extreme version of what we do. It's like, it's so, I think it can be so overwhelming for somebody, and especially if they haven't done the research and prepared as maybe I had done. And perhaps my rage about that was also a manifestation of that. But there's nothing boring about this. It's just, it was just a comment from somebody who I think was traumatized.
Well, certainly working in the field of the excavations, I mean, when I first arrived in 2014, it was very much, I didn't really know what I was getting into. And I honestly didn't really expect to join in. I kind of visited as a research student and then turned up, and Yoram Haimi was like, "Are you going to stay and get involved?" And I just kind of went along with it, and then ended up going back for 2 more seasons after that. So really, I think the way that it's kind of done at Sobibor in the excavations is this really lovely big team. So you have the Polish workers who are hired locally. They've been doing it since it began. So they have a brilliant work ethic. They really just do the job, and they're very good at kind of just being, they're not desensitized to it. You can have really meaningful and lovely conversations with them about it, but it's very much, we need to get this certain area done within a certain time. There's usually the elements against us. So it's kind of finding that balance of like, we need to do this, but we also, if you need to take a moment, you need to take a moment. And obviously I had to take quite a few moments because it was just so new to me. But fortunately the team is very professional, but we also laughed a lot, which I know sounds terrible, but it was very much, I think, a coping mechanism. just because you're dealing with such an extreme aspect of human nature. It's really, I don't know, something like laughing might seem appropriate, but it's just how we coped. And I'm very fortunate also when I, do my studies as well, to have a really great network of other academics or colleagues or, filmmakers, a lot of different kind of friends in different fields who we talk about things and we talk about what we're studying and how it's difficult. And again, we'll laugh about things, and it's kind of, I'm just very grateful to have always had a really good support network. I'm sure you guys find it within the center as well, that you support each other, and it's really good to have people around you who understand how difficult it actually is to deal with these things, especially when you're in COVID for 2 years and you're sitting at home working at the computer, writing every day about these really sort of traumatic things. It's really good to have that network around you.
Definitely. I think it's so important that debrief, particularly after something traumatic, a material or a story is shared. It's so important to be with other people that just understand. You can't go home and share this with your partner. It's not quite the same. You need someone that's immersed in it in the same way. And I think also it's, being at the center, people come in all the time and they just share their story, uninvited sometimes. And I feel like we're these memory keepers, and it's our responsibility to stay and to listen, because obviously they're having a moment where they need to share and they need to tell you the story, but it's still very draining. It's a privilege to hear someone's story, but it's draining. So to follow up on this, it's important to note that the study I referenced earlier, there were positive responses as well, not just trauma. People were reporting a sense of personal accomplishment and pride and professionalism. And a quote from the study that really resonated for me was, "The experience of trauma by individuals who worked intimately with Holocaust material becomes part of the shared experience of the catastrophe." And I think that's really tragic, but it's a beautiful way to look at the world. We may not have a personal connection to the Holocaust at first when we enter the field, but eventually it's like we're all in it together. Right. And I think that's what we're all basically saying from the stories that you shared. So another question that I had for you guys is, from both of your work, we're reminded of the power of the object. So for an institution like ours, the KHC, our space, we say this all the time, our space has no memory, right? It's here, it's very far removed from what had happened. So we rely on objects to bring a personal human component to the history instead of just facts printed on a panel. And that human component is vital. And that's why our survivors are so important to our work as well. It's our responsibility to share the stories of our community members, to preserve their history, to hopefully help them heal by letting them tell their stories to a group. So I was hoping both of you could maybe speak about connecting with survivors and descendants in the context of your projects. Do you feel a responsibility to do so? Has this aspect maybe brought you some peace because maybe you're bringing them some closure in some way? Maybe Hannah first. I feel like you did this quite a bit with your work, right?
Yeah, I mean, in addition to looking at the site itself, I mean, there were only between 48 and 50 survivors of Sobibor. So I only met one of these survivors firsthand, and that was actually just after I'd done the first round of excavations, and I met him at the synagogue in Warsaw, and he sang, and it was on Shabbat, and it was like this really incredibly moving moment and just a little overwhelming. He unfortunately passed away, but I've been working with his son. So basically part of my research is looking at inherited objects. So objects that are passed down in the family, and how those objects then kind of mediate inherited memory of the Holocaust, help shape the descendants' identities and connection to their family, perhaps family that were lost. So I have this really important part of my research, which also works directly and very closely with the descendants. So second and third generation survivors. And it's kind of really beautiful because specifically the group of survivors of Sobibor victims in Israel are all very close. So they all kind of grew up together, and they kind of all know each other, and they're all friends, and they all have this WhatsApp group, and they chat and get together. And once I started once I interviewed one of them, they were like, "Oh, you should speak to this person." And I kind of got passed around. And then, next time I go to Israel, I'm hopefully going to meet them all and in person, because we've done everything online because of COVID. But that really, I think once I started getting involved with that group, I actually realized how incredible they are at doing their own memory work and preserving their their family histories privately. So it feels really quite an honor to be able to tell their stories publicly in my research, which is really, it's lovely that they trust me with it as well. And it's really, I went to the home of Santa Barbara, to the home of Rena Smith. So she's Thomas Blatt's daughter. He was one of the survivors that ended up collecting a lot of information. He was very heavily involved with the preservation of the site and research. And, he was at every war trial. He, was kind of the real activist for getting memory work done at the site. And he just had this huge archive that was left. So, I've been in constant conversation with her for about 3 or 4 years and went to see the archive myself and look through things. And it really does feel like you're I know exactly what you mean when you're sort of being asked to be a keeper of the memory. And I just hope with my research that kind of puts that memory out there in a way that maybe the family doesn't have, I don't know, it's a different thing, isn't it? Giving it to somebody else to then put out there rather than it kind of been the burden on the family, which I think is obviously the role of museums as well, and donations that you guys get in your archive too.
And Jane, I know that for the purposes of this film, you were working mostly with conservators, but you've been on so many other projects.
Yeah.
Have you had the opportunity to interact with descendants or survivors?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that in, the organization I founded and run is called 3 Generations, and that really does sort of speak to intergenerational memory and trauma as well. But I think that one of the things I realized early on is that in having the privilege of hearing somebody's story, there are so many facets to that. One is just the moment of being told it and listening and engaging with that person and really hearing their experience. And then as we record that one way or another, it's being preserved. And then it is archived, and then lastly, it's something that then has another life of its own, if you like, and I think it is a bond of trust. And one of the things that I've done in the years I've been doing this is that I try really hard to keep in touch with all the people that I have filmed myself. And that is a sort of ever snowballing set of relationships, but they are some of the most meaningful parts of the work I do. And I really, I don't want to make it about me, but I do take pride in that because these relationships become, obviously with older people like Holocaust survivors, they pass away. But I've also, taken the stories and testimonies of very young women who have been sex trafficked or whatever, and I see them growing up and their lives evolving. And it's a sort of bond of trust. But it is, I think for me, it is the most gratifying part of the work, because I know that we have that connection, and whatever we can do respectfully with that is, kind of why you get up every day and do it, I think.
Thank you. That's beautiful. So Hannah, thinking back on your presentation, I was thinking about, was it David's name tag and the issues with it regarding the descendant not wanting it to remain where he died. And it's such a profound and sad thought, but also very understandable. And I thought maybe Dr. Cohen could speak a little bit to repatriation, because that was the first word that popped into my head when you were telling that story, but I've never heard of repatriation in this context before, because it's like from a museum institution. And so maybe perhaps you could speak to that, especially with your work in Srebrenica.
Yeah, I think that doing the work of Holocaust memorialization and finding artifacts, there's a preciousness to it. It's here, it's over 80 years old. We need to preserve it, because if we don't preserve it, we're going to lose the memory. But while you were talking, you mentioned briefly stumbling upon human remains. And so when I think about in Srebrenica, in particular in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in 1995, there was a genocide there. Over 8,372 men and boys were murdered. We're talking about the process by which human remains came up and were found. and the inability for the surviving, mostly women who were left, to have access to the human remains that were unearthed, because they were then claimed by the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, because they were considered to be legal evidence to try the perpetrators for the crimes. And in many cases, even clothing and objects, including ligatures around their eyes or around their wrists, their shoes, any sort of items, were also taken over by the court, and at some point were deemed unsanitary and not necessarily returned to the victims' families after the fact. And I was also thinking about how in Poland and in Germany and in many countries where this kind of work around the Holocaust is being done, there are rules, even though it's very complicated. In a place like Rwanda, where you go into these memorials, and specifically atrocity site memorials, what you find are things might be in glass containers, skulls, bones, physical paper, machetes, clothing with blood out in the air, or underground crypts with hundreds of coffins filled with thousands of bones. And so it's just such a striking contrast to think about how we, the sort of the field of forensic anthropology and archaeology, when we start to think about how we do these things for more recent crimes. In Cambodia, there's simply no process at all. There are signs if you go to the killing fields in Chung Ek in downtown Phnom Penh, where they just say, please don't take any of the bones or things that resurface out of the ground. And it sounds all very gruesome, but I think that, going back to this preciousness, these are artifacts from people at their most vulnerable moment before they're killed. And I think that this tension of how do we preserve this memory for future generations, but at the same time respecting the fact that these were personal items and they belong to people. And so I don't have an answer for that. But both of you have done this amazing research and this amazing way of helping people who haven't been to these sites wrestle with this. What it's like to walk into every day, to go to Sobibor and be there and feel that energy. And Jane, to go into the archival facilities, which in and of themselves are in a part of the camp. You can't even replace a piece of glass in Auschwitz-Birkenau without an entire team analyzing the glass and so forth. And, there's mud on the ground, and it's very much part of being there. So I want to just offer, a moment if you have any final reflections before we close.
I had something that I wanted to throw out, which I hope was that I hope you don't find this horribly inappropriate, but I don't know if any of you watched the Larry David Curb Your Enthusiasm episode, the last episode of the most recent series. But may I sort of say what happens, which is that he takes off his shoes because he steps in dog poop, and he goes into a Holocaust museum in Los Angeles, and he takes a pair of shoes from the when I watched it, I was absolutely speechless with horror that he had the nerve to do that. And I'm just curious what you all think about the place of comedy, if you like, it's like that he went right to the edge of what I think in our culture we would say is acceptable. He happens to be Jewish, so does that make it better? Probably, I don't know. I watched it again the other night, and I thought, well, I guess comedy is one way of sharing that. Does his doing that make an object? Does that teach those who deny the Holocaust the power it can have, or is it totally disrespectful? I mean, it's just something that I'm longing to know what you think about that. Brave or horrific or both, I don't know.
Hannah, would you like to comment?
Sure. It's a very good point. And I know that certain scholars are dealing with the subject of Holocaust comedy, and it kind of got this kind of idea of how we look at it. I think Jojo Rabbit, the film, really brought that up again as like a discussion, because it was this kind of dark comedy, and obviously Hitler has over the years, I mean, immediately after the war, in DP camps, you had the survivors kind of performing cabarets with people dressed as Hitler. It's, you know, it's the kind of the comedy of the Holocaust is nothing new, but I think you're right. I think the kind of the boundaries of it being pushed, and I think it's a lot to do with the kind of, which Laura was mentioning, the kind of sacredness of the Holocaust. Like, I do think that is an issue of in itself, and that like it's kind of this untouchable part of history and we can't make light of it and so on. I think that as far as what I understand about, I mean, I really like Curb Your Enthusiasm, and it's the same with, you know, the Seinfeld episode with the Polish relative who passes away, and you know, it really does seem to be part of kind of Jewish humor. And I know exactly what you mean about, well, because they're Jewish writers, it's Jewish comedians, can they get away with it? And I guess I don't really have a concrete answer for it, but I do think that comedy is quite a good way to address serious issues, actually, and kind of comment on maybe it's the kind of the sacredness of the Holocaust, that we can't compare it to other things, or we can't. I don't know. I think that comedy can sometimes provide a good way to look at these issues, actually.
I think it's hard, and Marissa and we talk about this regularly. So, and I think there's two different levels of comedy or humor. There's public comedy like Seinfeld and Larry David and Curb Your Enthusiasm, and how we wrestle with that as a society. But then there's the self-preservation for those of us that do the work, and the dark humor that comes up. And there's a language, and we, you know, we work, Marissa and I, all of you, work on Holocaust memory Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. And it is totally normal. On a Tuesday morning at 9:30, we had an event a few weeks ago about sexual violence in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And before lunch, we had talked about some of the most horrific things that had ever taken place. And then we're expected to end the call and go right about our day as if nothing that has been said has any sort of personal impact. And it's heavy. So we do have a dark humor in the office that we share only with trusted people to keep ourselves sane. But it's hard. I mean, I remember sitting in Jojo Rabbit, like, oh, some of this makes sense to me, but then I'm listening to people who don't know anything about the Holocaust and they're laughing. And, you know, and maybe a few years ago, it didn't feel as treacherous as it does right now, because, you know, what we're talking about now is no longer Holocaust denial. It's absolutely Holocaust distortion. This is a bigger problem. So no one's saying it didn't happen, but everybody is very keen to reinvent exactly what happened, who's responsible, and so forth. So I'm really glad you brought it up. I mean, it was something I learned about in Bosnia with a colleague that was working in another area of the country, and she encountered a mass grave, and there was a conversation about would she want to see it, and she expressed interest kind of happily. And again, that's from a research perspective, this is the kind of thing that you want to have exposure to, but then you also have to, there's so many different layers that are at play. Marissa, do you want to comment on this? I know we're running a little bit over, but it's a really important part of what we do.
I do think it's a great point, and it's an interesting just idea. And it kind of makes me think about like banned books, and it's like on the one hand, it's raising awareness of something. So maybe people that didn't know about the Holocaust or that genocide or whatever become knowledgeable of it. But then there is that risk that it gets distorted or it lessens the impact of it. And that's always the fear. So it's the same with those films, like Hollywood films of any true event. It does distort it. And for students, I think that's the biggest challenge. But I think it's a good way to engage with students. If you brought up that episode and you showed that clip and they laugh, and then you talk about it, and maybe they watch it again and then they don't laugh so hard, or maybe they're horrified, then that's like the best teachable moment, and it makes it worth it. And I mean, I think that's all we can hope for with things like that. But I feel like I have to watch that episode now.
Yeah, I have to watch that episode also. I'm not a huge fan of Curb, so maybe it's just because it feels super familiar, and I just need to do something different.
I've seen with an object, I think. So that was, you know.
Well, and I think the humor also comes in the fact that having boundaries around the work also, and how do we take care of ourselves and self-care. I'm sitting here as we're going through this event, realizing that we've got an idea for another conversation. So thank you both. Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Marissa. And thank you to everybody for tuning in this evening. It's been a really powerful conversation. We really appreciate you being here. We hope you stay safe and well. The recording will be available on our website very soon. And thank you to everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.
Bye.